All right, this lecture is going to be our introductory lecture for the humanities course. Um, Basically, starting with chapter 1, we want to at first define a couple of terms. You may at this point be a bit curious about what the humanities are, per se. On the one hand, the humanities are studying human culture, human civilization, human creativity. Within the realm of humanities, you can break it down into categories such as the arts, the sciences. Technology would fall into those categories of science, and let's say philosophy. And then kind of under the subheading of philosophy, we find religion. So really, anything that humans have thought or created, we consider part of the humanities. So this includes literature, this includes philosophy, dance, theater, acting, poetry. From the very beginning, humans have made significant efforts and contributions to culture where they have created all kinds of things. So this class will really look at what we've created as humans since the beginning of the written record. We're going to look at religion, which really is man's response to what they believe is the prompting of gods or goddesses, or the need to create myths in order to understand why the world works the way it works. And so systems of religion are created. Philosophy is where people sit around and they just keep asking questions and thinking critically, trying to figure out, why are we here? What does it mean to exist or to be? How do we understand ourselves in relationship to the world around us? How did we get here? Why are we here? All those great philosophical questions. The word philosophy is actually the combination of two Greek words, which is philos and sophia, which is the love of wisdom. If you've ever heard philos, maybe in relationship to the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, right? So that's how that word philos means love, but not in the erotic sense in the Greek, which would be eros, and not necessarily the unconditional kind of God love that you would find like in 1 Corinthians 13, which is agape. All of that is to say, the wise sages and philosophers sat around and tried to figure out what it meant, to exist, and to ask all of these deep, probing questions that in some ways are kind of silly, but are also important to how we understand ourselves as humans. So that would be your philosophy. Then you've got, even the aesthetic studies, where you look at examples of activity, maybe theater, dance. You're looking at the art itself, looking at paintings. When you're actually studying what you see on the surface, but you're asking the next question, going deeper into what does this mean. And so in many ways, humanities, as we teach it in this course, is kind of a combination of a lot of different courses, all kind of packed into one powerhouse of a course that deals with religion, deals with philosophy, deals with art history, music, architecture. Architecture is a very important part of the humanities. Literature is crammed in there as well. So that's kind of a breakdown of just what the humanities are. But just to begin with chapter 1, let me say a few things just concerning what you find in your book. So basically, between 50,000 to 25,000 years ago, human beings began to come together and for a common good, they began to become more sophisticated and formed what we call civilization. So civilization is this gathering together of people, society, if you will, coming together for trade and fellowship and working together and getting along. But at the same time, out of that emerges what we call culture. Anytime there's a civilization, you always find culture right alongside. So civilization is a social, economic, and political entity distinguished, by the ability to express itself through images and written language. A culture that possesses the ability to organize itself thoroughly and communicates through written language. So that is how you would understand civilization. There's always going to be an expression of ideas. There's going to be literature. There's going to be written things, laws. Often in the earliest examples of civilization, people began to write down the laws of the land, so to speak. So the very first civilizations emerged in ancient history. We find them typically at the intersection of rivers, because those tend to be very fertile places. And so the oldest of which, many look back to civilization emerging between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is what we call Mesopotamia. And that's actually two more Greek words. You might find me referencing a lot of Greek words because I did study Greek in my undergraduate, a little bit in graduate school. But Mesos means middle, and Potamos means river, right? So you've got the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia, which were the Tigris and the Euphrates. In Egypt, the Nile River was a source of life, and so a lot of ancient civilization history we can study emerged there in relationship to the Nile. The Indus River in India, which was on the Indian subcontinent, the Yellow River in China. So these were all rivers that we can look at it historically and see where early civilization emerged, because there was life. Where you find water, you find life. And where you find water, you find the ability to sustain life, because we need water to live. Crops need water to grow. Livestock need water to survive. So Mesopotamia would be that one place where we look at the emergence of culture, civilization, if you will. So agriculture was very big in those places because, like I said, crops need water, and so they would grow their crops near these rivers, so they'd have a constant irrigation. Rivers are also ways to travel between cities, and so trade routes began to follow along rivers. So civilization began to emerge along the rivers, and trade was typically managed in those times by the elite ruling class. And so at the same time, anytime you have an exchange of goods, anytime you have an exchange of currency for product, you're going to find dispute. I mean, it's just kind of the way things go in life. And so along with these the rising of civilization, we also find the rising of wars and conflicts. A culture within a civilization would typically consist of these things, and this is how your book frames it as well. A set of common values. Okay, so again, even you'd have conflict between groups that are engaging in trade and commerce, right? And you've also got a conflicting, sets of values and ideas, often religious differences, and that hasn't really changed. Even to this day, you can see difference in religious belief, leading to conflict, and also having an adverse effect on economy and the way we trade globally with certain groups. So culture would be the set of values, beliefs, and behaviors that governs or determines a common way of living formed by a group of people and passed on from one generation to the next. So when we look at the history, I guess you could say, the historical record, we don't really have history before we have writing. And so we call that time period prehistory. Nobody wrote down anything, we don't know. It's hard to say. It's not historical. We have evidence. It's archaeological. It can tell us things, but we consider the beginning of the written record to be the beginning of history. Ironically, and I find it kind of interesting myself, is if you look at three of the oldest calendars that we can find, we've got the Egyptian calendar, the Jewish calendar, and the Mayan calendar. They all kind of start around 4,000 to 3,000 BCE. And that's really interesting, I think, because at some point there was this beginning period. Somewhere around 4,000 BCE is when written language enters the picture. So let's see, 4,236 years before the Common Era was the earliest date in the Egyptian calendar. 3,760 years before the Common Era was the earliest date in the Jewish calendar, and 3,372 years before the Common Era was the first date on the Mayan calendar. And just so you know, also dealing with the BC, BCE, Common Era, AD, all that controversy. Just to clarify, I will probably use those terms interchangeably. Sometimes I may see BC, sometimes I may say BCE. I think both are fair. I get why people don't want to say before Christ, because not everyone believes that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ, and so I get it, I understand. It's really, I don't know if you know the whole history of the before Christ kind of dating thing, but BC, right, stands for before Christ, but that's actually, interestingly, just a English kind of version of a Latin phrase, which is ante Christum natum, which would be abbreviated as ACN. So nobody ever says ACN. The reason why I think it's interesting is because the AD is Latin, and that's short for Anno Domini, which is shortened for Anno Domini Nostri Jesu Christi, which means the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. Why we go from ante natum, I don't know, ante Christum natum to BC to before Christ. Somehow that shift happened, and it's hard to really nail down historically why. But the Anno Domini dating system was actually invented by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, and that was he lived somewhere around 470 to 544 AD, or Common Era, if you will. The funny thing is, why I always think it's interesting, and I raised this point in my anthropology class when I was in my undergrad program. The instructor said, well, we're not going to say BC, because not everyone believes in Christ, but we're going to say the Common Era. We're going to say before the Common Era. And so, me being smart, I guess I raised my hand and I said, well, what is it about the era that is so common? Well, it would be the life of Christ, or the rise of Christianity. So historically, I think I get it, why you don't want to offend people, whatever, but You can't dodge the fact that historically we're dealing with a time period that was centered around this Christ figure, Jesus of Nazareth, and the rise of Christianity. And so, anyway, I may say BC, I may say BCE, whatever. I mean the same thing, because the era that is common is only common because of this Christ figure. So, anyway, so although, we have some written record that we believe started around 4000 BCE, there is also some written language that has been discovered in more recent times, maybe as old as 12,000 years, in civilization that might even be 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. In Turkey, there was a discovery where they found some ancient writing that maybe even that old, but to be able to translate it, interpret it, and understand it, that's a whole other thing. So what were people writing down? I guess that's one thing that's interesting to ask. So in this time, these ancient civilization, people began to develop language and write things down. But what are they writing down? Ironically, they were writing down where people came from, myths, emergent stories about how the people came about. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and where do the people come from? And dealing with these sort of religious, if you will, mythological ideas, people began to write down these interaction with the gods kind of stories and myths, and really quite fascinating and consistent across all of the ancient systems. And so as time progressed, people began to investigate the natural world, as well as what it meant to be human. And so in our earliest myths, if you will, some would kind of say, people were uneducated and dumb, unsophisticated. But really, if you think about it, it's quite a feat of philosophical inquiry, scientific inquiry, if you will, to look at the natural world and begin to ask questions and to go deeper and try to understand why this exists, how it got here. And while some may think that their conclusions that we, were formed by the hands of the gods, might to some seem unsophisticated, at the same time, we have to give a little bit of credit to our ancestors for asking the questions in the first place. Thinking, critically and inquiring and saying, what is it around us how did this come to be? And so on some levels, I wouldn't be so quick to chalk up our ancient ancestors to being morons. They weren't. They were actually thinking quite interestingly, very deeply, and in very interesting ways that began to set the trajectory for us as we think today. We don't think philosophically and scientifically in some kind of vacuum. We are in a long line of a trajectory of philosophical thinking. Started with people sitting around trying to figure out how we got here. And so now we think we have better, more scientific, less religious answers, I guess, if you will. But we're still trying to, ponder that first cause, that first moment when life began, when there was a time there wasn't life, and then there was a time that, bam, something happened, Big Bang, if you will. Still, we're asking the same kinds of questions. We're just coming up with different kinds of answers scientifically, than we were 5,000 years ago. Just to give you a definition here, humanism, okay, let me clarify. We're studying the humanities, but then you have humanism, which is also philosophical. And so many would say the humanist believes that, humankind is the ultimate good, that we as humans are the ideal. We embody all morality and ethical thinking that we don't need external systems to influence us, that humanists would say, the chief end of man is man, that we are, the beginning and the end. We are our own God, if you will. And so, just to clarify, the study of the humanities is a little bit different because we're looking at what man has created, what has been a product of being human. And in that productive system, there is much philosophical thought that attributes the highest end or meaning to existence as worship of the gods or God, and some religious systems. So humanism, a little different than studying the humanities. Let's see. So in China, Confucius codified the formalities of social interaction, moderation, personal integrity, self-control, loyalty, altruism, and justice. And so just to kind of look on a humanistic level, we see this this kind of ethical dimension that emerged in the philosophical thinking in the ancient culture, ancient times. In Mesopotamia and Greece, human character and the ability to work things out in the face of adversity was found in the epic and dramatic literature of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. In Greece, humanism was also the subject of philosophy, literally the love of wisdom, as I had told you before, the practice of reasoning that followed from the Greek philosopher Socrates' famous dictum, know thyself. And so asking the human question, looking inward for our answers, right? The Romans come along and basically plagiarize the Greeks. And so that would be kind of the humanist tradition that we see philosophically moving through time. So just a little bit about kind of the myth angle. For one, your book talks about the cave drawings, the Chave cave drawings. Now, these drawings are interesting because they actually kind of point to us understanding the ancient people as kind of sophisticated and not, stupid. So the culture they kind of represent in their cave drawings encompasses the values and behaviors shared by the group of people developed over time and passed down from one generation to the next. Okay, right? So culture manifests itself in the laws, customs, ritual behavior, and artistic production common to the group. But their cave drawings kind of represent the mythological tale of what was important to them, and it comes across quite sophisticated, some scholars agree. But just to clarify also, you've heard me say this word myth, and I don't know, maybe if you're like I am, when I hear myth, I tend to think like something untrue. Like I think of the show Mythbusters, right? So they make an effort to prove whether something is true or not, like, will your wings fall off of an airplane going so fast, that after they reach a certain speed, and they would test that. So we're kind of testing a law of physics, putting science to the test to see if something is true or not. But when we say myth in the academic sense, or like in the humanities, or in anthropology, or religion, even religious studies or sociological studies, we may say the word myth, but myth just means story. Now, I think it's silly that is what has come about, because it's like taking one word that had a previous meaning, that everyone was in unity on the definition of it, and then saying we're going to apply it to people's sacred beliefs, and we're going to call those sacred beliefs those stories myths. But we don't mean that they're untrue. We just mean to say that they don't have to be true. They're just stories, and they're effective, which I get it, but I don't think it's fair. I think it actually upsets a lot of people who have very strong convictions. And when you say that their creation story is a myth, then they find that offensive. But I think it's a little bit of wordplay, and it's kind of an intellectual, almost even snooty thing to do, but we can't do anything about it. So we call them myths. That's what they're called. We just have to accept that and move on. So when I say myth, I don't really mean untrue. I mean like a story. And let me give you some examples of what we would call myth in the context that we use the word. So when I say myth, it could mean like a story of the gods. It could mean a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, fundamental events like how a mountain range came into being. Ancient civilizations would have a story of, the great eagle god, flew over the valley and dropped, anyway, just something crazy that would, to us might seem kind of outlandish, but it would be a myth about how that mountain range came to be. They tore apart their cousin moon bear and dropped the pieces on the valley, and it made a mountain range. I'm making this stuff up, but these are the kind of things you might read in some Native American myths. And by myths, I mean stories, fundamental events, like how things came to be. Myths tell of the deeds of the gods, as a result of which the world, nature, and culture were created together and given order. A myth expresses and confirms society's religious values and norms. To tell for example, the story of how the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and as he went up and he was in the presence of God, and this quote unquote myth is a way of expressing how the law, the order, the values of the Hebrew society, the Israelite society, was given, and many hold those origins to be significant to today's societies, and so they would say, well, the laws that we have written on our hearts were given to us, passed down from God and inscribed into the stone by Moses. So that would be a myth that would try to explain, society's values and norms. A myth might provide patterns of behavior to be imitated, which behavior that's imitated from a myth is what we call a ritual. Just again, to kind of keep it Judeo-Christian for your context of understanding, you might be more familiar with these ideas. The reason people do the Lord's Supper or communion or the Eucharist, they're carrying out what Christ himself in the story does by breaking the bread and saying, "This is my body, eat. This is my blood, drink." And so the ritual is carrying out the myth of the story of when Christ sat with his apostles and he carried out this function. Again, the word myth there, not necessarily attempting to apply validity or historicity, to the event, but to say there was a story, we hear the story, we carry it out, or Christian believers carry it out, and that is the ritual side of it. So when we say myth, it might mean these patterns of behavior that we imitate, is what I'm saying. So the true, milieu or mixed, conglomeration of myth is to be found typically in religious rites and ceremonies. The ritual acting out of myth implies the defense of the world order. As the theory on this goes, myths tend to give order to something chaotic. When you read for instance, in the very beginning, the creation myth, and most creation myths, there was some sort of chaos at hand. There was some sort of over the darkness and the waters of the deep, and there was this kind of primordial nothingness, and then there was like light, and somehow the chaos was subdued by this myth of how then order came, but that's on a very, very base level. Many other very complex rituals in many indigenous belief systems are very long and very detailed, and they're intended shamans and healers who go through these very extravagant rituals to cleanse, to create order, to remove demons and cast out spirits, which again creates order. And they're typically following some sort of mythological story in the process. And usually the shaman or the healer, the witch doctor, they know that, right? But then also the participants, they're familiar with the myth as well. This is a vastly immense topic that just scratching the surface on is about all I'm going to be able to do. I've taken entire courses in graduate school that were just on this issue, on myth, and we looked at all different kinds of Alaskan, indigenous tribes and their mythological stories and their rituals, and it's very deep topic. So I don't want to get bogged down, but let me move forward. Maybe I'll be able to relate some of this myth concept to something you may be a little more familiar with. So the reason that we use the term myth, right, in everyday language, has no connection with how it's used in a scholarly sense, and that's really what I'm trying to get down to. In ordinary language, myth is often used to express something untrue or utopian or misguided, but in the way we're going to say myth, we mean story, just a tale. So a ritual drama, right, could be a form of myth acted out, right? That's your ritual. Liturgical recitation, where they recite some sort of liturgy or quote some sacred scripture or oral tradition, that's narrated myth, in which case both verbal and nonverbal media, sermons, hymns, prayers, religious dances can be utilized in that process. So similarly, myth can be manifested in religious art, right? Icons and symbolic signs. Religions are shot through with symbols. If you just even think, the Sikhs have a very unique, particular symbol. If you look at Christianity, the symbol of the cross. If you look at Judaism, you have the Star of David, right? If you look at the Wiccan belief, the kind of pagan belief, and the pentagram and the five-pointed star. Symbols are, and even beyond just the ones you think of, and like the most blatant ones, we can move beyond that into the sign of the fish for the Christians, or anyway, any number of symbols. There's so many. I don't want to get stuck there, but you can probably think of a few yourself. So in addition to these codified forms, we also have the way in which myth is transmitted in speech, thought, dreams, and other modes of behavior. So just to clarify, ritual, you may not consider yourself a very ritualistic person, but you might be surprised. Ritual is carried out in so many parts of what we consider culture, even mainstream, even pop culture, that we don't even really think about it. So bringing in the new year, right? You wouldn't think, but that's a ritual. In fact, if I was to just describe the things we do in the rituals, the ritual of bringing in the new year, you'd know what holiday I was speaking of. I said we count down, the ball drops, we drink a toast of champagne, and then you kiss somebody and regret it later. I don't know, whatever. But that would be an example of a myth carried out, a ritual, if you will, and you would say, oh, that's New Year's. I know that. Even the way we play sports. Sports are very ritualize, the way we participate as viewers, as spectators of the sport itself. We, are very ritualistic, and I have to have, sit in my chair in front of, my, 65-inch flat screen, and, I never miss a game, and, church better not run late because I got to go watch the Cowboys. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? So very ritual in the way we play sports, very systematized in the way we participate. People are fanatical. For example, football around the world, soccer. People are very intense in their commitment and devotion to their sports team, to their soccer team, that to the point of violence. Crazy stuff, right? But anyway, so marriage, when you get married, the walking down the aisle, all of that is symbolic. It's all a ritual. Even to where the bride stands in relationship to the groom, the pastor or the priest or the officiator, may say certain things that are generally said in every wedding ceremony. It's very, very ritualized. Christmas, Easter, Valentine's Day, all of these things are rituals. And if I described the symbols of those holidays, you would know what holiday I was referring to based on the symbolism. Some people even have rituals when they move into a new house. It's our housewarming party, or whatever. Like, people have these rituals. They're very common. It's part of being human. Religious rituals, interestingly, help tell the meaningful stories or the myths as well. So let's say maybe you've, for example, like the La Posada, which is purely tradition. It's not based on any biblical account of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, or maybe, I think Jesus isn't even born. I'm not really sure. But they go door to door. It's around Christmas time, and they knock on the door and try to find somewhere that will take them in because there was no room at the inn. And it's a carried out ritual. It's very systematized, but it helps to tell a meaningful story. Helps to kind of give a backdrop or some deeper context to the nativity. A Jewish Seder, right? You go through all these things. It's supposed to represent the Passover ritual that was prescribed to the Jews, the Israelites. Well, they weren't Israelites yet, but the Jews, the Hebrews, when they were in Egypt, right? And then go to the door and see if Elijah is here. Interesting stuff, right? So even in Islam, like the Hajj is a ritual reenactment of critical faith-testing events of the life of Abraham. So it kind of tells the story of Abraham and his wife Hajar, right? That's where we get the word Hajj or Hagar, as most of you might have heard it, and their son Ismail. And so the Hajj is part of retelling the story. It's a ritualizing of the myth of the story of what Hagar goes through, given by the Prophet Muhammad. Baptisms, communion, those are rituals as well. All right. So the Anasazi are very interesting, and what I've wanted you to do is to actually watch I'm going to show you here. When you finish this, you're going to watch a brief video on the Anasazi, and then there is a brief creation myth story. It's Japanese, and just to kind of give you kind of some ideas of what I'm talking about here in context to the class and what you're gonna read in your book. The Anasazi were relatives, right, of the Zuni Pueblo. They have an emergence tale. That's in your book. All that's in your book and stuff. So I'm going to end this first lecture there. So watch the video the two videos that I'm going to post below, one on the Anasazi and the Kojiki Chronicles of Japan, which is Azanagi and Izanami. I don't speak Japanese, so there you go. That's the best I got. But it's like 6 minutes long, that one, and tells the story of kind of how we came to be. It's a different creation myth, maybe one different than what you've been familiar with. All right, so I'm going to end this lecture here.